One time there was a king, like every good Jewish parable starts, right? And of course, the king had a son, a servant. Wow, Moshe Shmuel. Okay. So this king maybe also had a servant, but this king had a son. The son was a prince. Good. So you can do tshuva. We're going to deal with this afterwards. So the king had a prince, and the prince went to a faraway land, to a land that he's never been to before, a land where the culture is different, and life was different. And he got there and he saw an amazing thing. On the streets, around the houses, in the marketplace, beautiful rocks, some diamonds, some had light, were shining lights, and everyone was walking around their life casually, like didn't understand. He's like, where I come from, these are so precious, and yet no one's paying attention to it. He's like, well, I'm only here for a few more days. Let me make sure, as they say in some language, to chaperein, right? So he starts collecting and feeling as much as he could collect. It's like when you go on the airplane, and you can only get one carry-on and one check-in. If you had the same experience, but you have two pockets here, and you start swishing, right? So he filled up all his pockets with all the diamonds and with all the beautiful jewels. And he comes back to his homeland, to the king, bringing back all these jewels. Everyone's amazed. How did you do that? Where did you get this from? So he tells them, I went to a land here. Nobody really noticed them. They're just lying around. They're just casually. Says the Chafetz Chaim, a beautiful idea. Yikarahi mipninim. The Torah is Yikarahi mipninim. The Gemara says Torah learning is more precious than the avodah, the service of the Kohen Gadol, going into the Kodesh HaKodashim. Yikarahi mipninim. He said it's diamonds. Neshama comes down to this world, a world that it's not used to, and it looks around, and people are just living casual lives. And he says, every word of Torah is a mitzvah. Why aren't people collecting as much as you can? Says the Chafetz Chaim, he's writing in the Sefer Torah Sabayis, that's our job. Every word is a mitzvah. We have to collect as many diamonds as we can. Live with those diamonds, appreciate the diamonds. So I think that one of the ideas that the Torah is compared to diamonds is not only our attitude towards it, to leave the casual attitude and grow into the preciousness of every word of Torah. I think what makes a person a successful person in learning, someone who's teaching a lot, someone who is, loves giving over the Torah, when their attitude towards the Torah is every little piece, every little novelty, every good question, it's a diamond. And when you view it that way, you remember the diamonds and you hold on to them. So I think we have a beautiful merit, a beautiful schus that there's somebody who I got to know better as I came to the West Coast. But that's what I so far have taken away, that there's so much Torah and it's so exciting because it's a diamond. When it's a diamond, you save it, you put it in, you publish books, you publish svarim, and it's exciting. So we should all merit, hopefully today, to appreciate more the diamonds that Hashem gave us and appreciate the people that work tirelessly day in and day out to absorb as many diamonds, as possible in order to share it with everybody else. So thank you very much, Rabbi Shoff, for spending the day sharing your diamonds and your pearls, and hopefully it'll be an inspiration to everyone here to, in their own way, try to figure out how can I collect some more diamonds. And that way the neshama will be very happy, and everyone should enjoy and have a beautiful day.
Thank you, Rabbi Glazer. That was something else. I'm really happy to be here. I mean it. This is a very beautiful, authentic community. For just a few hours I've already been able to spend here last night. There's a warmth and a sincerity and a kindness. It's beautiful here. And I'm pleased to be able to learn a little Torah with you. The subject is positivity, simcha, enthusiasm. I want to come from what I think is a different angle. I just want to give you guys some time to talk, to learn, to have your own perspectives too. But let's open it with this. The Talmud says, so here it's on page 2. You do not have to look inside. You do not have to read it. That is totally not necessary. Some people learn more effectively when they are looking at text and others do not. So whatever works for you. Rav Sheshes said, in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azari, this is an ancient Jewish teaching. Kol hamivaze es hamoados. Any person who disgraces Jewish holidays, he belittles them. He doesn't take Jewish celebrations of the Chagim seriously. Ki'ilu oved avodah zarah. That person, you are to look at them. You're supposed to judge that person. You're supposed to look at that person as if they are an idol worshiper. They disgrace them. This doesn't mean a person who's not perfect at their observance. It doesn't mean a person, right? A person who belittles them, doesn't take seriously these shenemar, and it's the proof is from two verses in the Torah that are put next to each other. One of them says, Elohei masecha, lo sasalecha. Do not make gods that are molten, that you poured. You made them yourself out of hot metal or something, gold. You put them in some sort of a form. They come out as an idol. Don't make those. And the very next verse is Es Chag Hamatzos Tishmor. Celebrate the holiday of Passover, and it goes on to talk about all the Jewish holidays. So you see that the Torah links together two ideas: belittling the Jewish holidays and worshiping idols. If you don't do this one, you're doing that one. It's kind of cryptic. Worshipping idols is an interesting thing because, it's bad, I guess, to worship the wrong God, but I think you and I understand, right? That's one of the things Torah doesn't want you to do. But I think you and I understand that not every person who's a pagan or who's raised with some interesting African religion is a bad person in any way. This is what they were raised to do. This is how they understand the world. And we dream of days when the world becomes enlightened and the whole world is filled with knowledge of God as water fills the seas. But our attitude generally towards, Jews who are not as observant, or even just people that are living with what we understand to be ignorance, and it's not malicious, is that it's a shame. If only we could bring light to the world and be a light to the nations. My understanding is that Avraham Avinu dedicated his life, the great father Abraham. Avram dedicated his life to enlightening people who are idol worshippers and bringing monotheism to the world. He didn't dedicate his life to saying, well, I got to write them all off and stick with my own insular community of just me and my wife and my nephew. That was not the orientation. So what are we supposed to learn from this? That it's similar to idol worship. It's not just saying they're a bunch of rotten scoundrels. It's teaching us something very meaningful. Okay, so here's the introductory teaching. Rav Meir Varzir published this work called Kosnos Or in Frankfurt on the Oder. There's two Frankfurts. One is on the Main River and one is on the Oder. Sort of like there might be two Portlands, right? You could have such a thing in a country. So there they didn't... Frankfurt on Oder was 1754. This book was published. That's a while back. He said the following. And this is a well-quoted... Through the years, this teaching took on a new life in the Hasidic masters and others because it's so rich. Moshe came back, Vayar ha'amti boshesh Moshe. Boshesh Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to the mountain to receive the Torah, and he delays in his return. When he doesn't come back when expected, Boshesh, which means to delay, when that happens, the Jewish people lose everything. And they go and build a golden calf. Idolatry. That's what happens. What caused it? Boshesh Moshe, he was late. So listen to this. He says, Boshesh, our sages tell us, is Boshesh. He came after 6 hours. The Jewish people spent 6 hours worshiping idols, worshiping the golden calf. They were dancing, they were engaged for 6 hours, and that was all. Not so much. And he says, if you look at the Jewish holidays, according to the way the Torah describes you're supposed to celebrate them, there are 3 regalim, 3 pilgrimage festivals, the 3 central celebratory holidays. Pesach is 7 days long in the Torah. Outside of Israel, we'll have an 8th day. Sukkot is 7 days long. Outside of Israel, we'll have another day tacked onto the end. And there's something called Shmini Atzeres, which is a holiday too, but the Talmud, he says, calls that a regel b'fnei atzmo. That's its own thing. So he says of just the 3, you have 7, 7, and 1, which is 15. How many hours are there in 15 days? So, well, in 10 days, there's 240, and another half, 360, right? Who's with me on this complicated math? So 360 hours of celebrating are supposed to happen every year of the Jewish holidays. It is 60 times 6 is 360. Now, we know that there's a rule called Botel B'Shishim, that if you're cooking something and a little bit of milk, gets into a meat pot, if there are 60 times meat to that one part of milk, so then you can eat it. So if you celebrate the Jewish holidays, then it totally decimates the idolatry. That's the teaching. Gets rid of it. But if you're mevaze es hamoados, any person who goes and belittles the Jewish holidays, so he doesn't have those 360 hours, in which case he's stuck with the golden calf. There's a lot more to this teaching. We'll get into it a little further. He shows a whole bunch of other parallels that are very interesting. But let's just start with that awareness, that there's 360 hours of one thing and 6 hours of another thing, and that has such an enormous impact that if you don't do this, you're left with the golden calf. It says, for example, there was the story in the Touro when the sorcerer Bilam comes to curse the Jewish people. He's hired to curse the Jews. So I don't know, mainstream media, I don't know which similar jobs today are very well paying, maybe to teach in a university, right? That's so Bilam is hired to curse the Jews. And not every university, not every professor, just the Jewish one. But Bilam realized, I can't curse the Jews. It's not working. And Bilam realized it was good in the eyes of Hashem to bless Israel. So he turned his face to the desert. What's the point of that? Why is he turning to the desert? Says the Targum Yonasan. It's printed on the page of a standard Mikros Gedolos. He turned to the desert, focusing his face on the location where the Jews worship the golden calf. If you can bring that up to God, then maybe you can really get the Jews. Look how bad they were. That was his hope. Perhaps to bring that up in the psyche of the Jewish people too. When you catch a child red-handed doing something wrong, that's not always the best thing for the child. You're a liar is not always the best solution. Sometimes you want to allow the person not to identify themselves in that way, and to see themselves as a good person who no one else notices their weaknesses. I think we all want that. So that would be an enormous curse for the Jewish people to start identifying themselves with the golden calf. And it didn't work because the angel of Hashem caused Bilam to have this whole problem. And he had to go to the side. The donkey could see the angel and Bilam couldn't. And the whole story goes that eventually the angel opens his mouth and says to Bilam, "Why are you beating your donkey?" Because he hit his donkey 3 times. But he uses an interesting language. He says, "Why did you strike your donkey these shalosh regalim?" These 3 regalim. So that's the name for the holiday. So Rashi says right there, "Atam bevakesh la'akor umah." You're fruitlessly seeking to uproot a nation that celebrates the 3 regalim. So what's the connection? So says Rav Meir Varzir, this is the connection. Because they did do the golden calf, but they do the shalosh regalim. In fact, the word shalosh in Torah is always spelled shin lamed shin. It's spelled as a 3-letter word. The vav is not necessary because it has the vowelization. But here it's spelled with an additional vav. And it's brought in some of the Svarim. It's brought Rav Yosef Gigi of Tunisia, about 150 years ago. He writes that extra vav, and he quotes an earlier work that I'm not so familiar with, but he says in there, in his commentary to the Haggadah, that extra vav is to make the same point we just made. Do you see how that vav, which adds up to 6, is the 6 hours that they worship the golden calf, but it is blended in and subsumed by the shalosh regalim. And that's why an additional vav is put in that you don't read and makes no difference in terms of the vowelization, whether it's there or not, to make this beautiful point. Okay. So I want to take a step back first and understand the basic concept that we're going to start with. And that is, you can't always fight the 6 hours. What does that mean? I'll give you like a couple practical examples, even though, that's also for you to come up with too, because we all have different lives. We worry a lot about exposing our children to the world. And if they see this and there's foul language and there's violence and there's the next thing. I mean, that's something to be legitimately worried about. It's important to understand that we live in a world today. I always picture the distinction between today's world, 150 years ago, somebody being raised in Kalvaria, Lithuania. What I will see in one day, walking down the street in Los Angeles, looking at a billboard on my phone, or in an Uber, what's showing, they have a screen in front of me. What I will see in one day, they didn't see in a lifetime. What your child has seen in the cleanest of environments by 8, 9, 10, 11 years old is beyond what a person in their lifetime would be exposed to in some small little Jewish shtetl. We're in a very exposed world. It is very, very difficult to hide people from everything. When I saw, as a child, some of my friends who were the most sheltered were the ones who, the minute they got an ounce of freedom, went and exposed themselves to everything they possibly could. It didn't really work, the extreme sheltering. So how do we balance this? And there's one very important thing for us to remember. You can't only play defense. Sometimes, if you pile on 360 hours of the right stuff, then the 6 hours of the other stuff goes away. It becomes less important. So that celebrating Judaism, if Passover is fantastic, if being a Jew is wonderful, it's enjoyable, we love our sukkah, and we love the holiday of Shavuos, and it's positive, and it's warm, and it's delicious, and there are good foods, and it's just the ultimate celebration. So then, what happens to those other 6 hours? They stop giving all that much flavor to life. There is no comparison between the joy that Judaism provides in an authentic way when celebrated and done well to anything else that the world has to offer. There's nothing. And therefore, if you can create an environment for yourself where the things that fill you with joy and positivity and enthusiasm are authentic things, nothing is going to come close. There's no feeling that you can give your children that is going to fill them up more with joy, if done correctly, than when they're doing something kind and when they visit somebody, right, in the hospital or in a home, and they bring them joy and they see that this makes a difference. When we do good things, we feel good. And the relationship of celebrating with Torah is so fundamental that I'm seeing a very clear pattern. Even people who are a little bit more exposed sometimes, when the Judaism that they're experiencing is warm and positive and authentic, and it's just great, why would you stop doing Shabbos? If Shabbos is wonderful, if it's positive, if it's excellent. Okay. Let's take another step. Let's take one more step. We said this number 60 times. What is this business about 60 times? Our sages tell us there are 6 things. So it should say a 5, but there is a 6th elsewhere, which we do bring, but that was just a typo. The 5 is next to the 6. The Talmud of Bracha says there are 5 lists 5 things that are 1/60th. What does it mean? Fire is a 60th of the pain of the fires of hell. Okay, that's not what we're going to talk about today. That's for the negativity speech next time on Labor Day. Yeah. So, but in other words, the simple understanding, by the way, of the fires of hell is brought in the Dessler writes about this at great length, quoting earlier sources, is the burning pain and shame that a person has when they look at themselves truly honesty after a lifetime and they just didn't live the way they know they should have. That's a very, very frightening prospect. When a person looks and says, I should have bit my pride a little bit and reconciled with my sister. I just should have. And they look back at their life and they realize that was not right. I should not have done that. That was a mistake. It's compared to the burning of fire. Honey, the sweetness of honey. You take a little honey, you put on your tongue. That is like 1/60th of the man, of the sweetness of the man that the Jewish people, the manna that fell from heaven when the Jewish people were in the desert. Shabbos is a 60th of the world to come. Sleep is 1/60th of death, and dreams are a 60th of prophecy. So what is this 1/60th? What's that about? Says the Marsha. In the 1600s. He says, remember we talked about 60 parts to 1 part. So are you good at fractions? What is that? If I have 60 parts meat and 1 part milk, what is that? It's 1/61, right? Because there's 61 total parts and 1 of them is milk. You understand? I mean, we can reduce to a half, but right? So what's the principle? The principle is, if I can still taste, Tom Kicker, if I can taste milk and meat in one dish, that's considered that there's milk and meat here, according to the Torah. How do you measure it? Based on taste. And we can say, our rabbis tell us, that the general rule is, and this is what we go with, that if you have 60 times as much of one thing, there's no more taste. You cannot identify the taste of the milk in the meat anymore. So far, so good. Well, what happens if you have 1/60th? You could still taste it. It's the least possible amount that any human being could taste. If there was any less, it would be undiscernible. So 1/60th is the way of saying there's still the faintest taste left. And if you're really careful, you can just barely get it. Is that beautiful? That's what it means whenever we say 1/60th. So that's what it means that when you visit the sick, Talmud tells us elsewhere, you take away 1/60th of their illness. So then the Talmud goes on and it says, well, wait a minute, let's get 60 guys all at once, right? So it says, first of all, each person takes away a 60th of what's left. And then, so that's one thing. A second thing the Talmud says is it only works if the person is ben gilo. It only works if you have the same mazel as that person. You're a similar person to them. You've had similar life experiences. When you visit the sick, so the first thing is, when you visit the sick, there is some discernible benefit to that person. It takes away a little bit of the pain of that. It's something. I mean, it's not going to cure. Most of the time, it's not going to cure. But it's something. The 60th, it can be touched. It can be felt. The Shabbos, it's almost undiscernible in Shabbos. The fact, right? It's almost undiscernible, the fact that there's just a taste of the world to come. But it's there. And if you're quiet, if you experience it, and if you can feel it. And so too with all the other 1/60ths. As an aside, what is this business about if it's Ben Gilo? So I want to share with you something very interesting. One more time. A person visits the sick, they have a discernible impact on that person. When you come and you share someone else's pain, you try to help them, you sit with them, you take away a little bit of their... Was that a hand going up?
It's related. You don't have to answer. It's so news.
Okay, thank you for that out. In case I don't know, I'll be like, oh, it's not related. Yeah.
I was thinking about 1/60th of prophecy being sleep. When someone's had in prophecy, I know that it talks about it like in an altered state, kind of like a sleep-like state. But shouldn't it be more like in a awake state, and the life living like now is like a sleep? You know?
I do. So I want to just, you're saying the right thing. You're saying sleep, but sleep was like death, which actually supports your position, and dreams happen when you're sleeping. So you're still right. The question stands. And I think the attitude is this. There is a verse in the book of Shmuel, which is shocking. I'm going to say it over to you, and it's shocking when you hear it. Because you just keep reading and you don't realize it. Shaul, the great king Shaul, comes on a band of wandering prophets So he also took off all of his clothing and joined them and had prophecy. That's the pasuk. Vayishu kam hu as bigadav. So he also took, it sounds like he went to a hippie commune or something, and like, okay, what's happening here? Says the Radak. Here's how prophets used to have prophecy. They would take themselves as far as they could get from normal life. They would go out into the desert, into less civilized areas. So they're part of nature. And they would get rid of all the trappings of clothing, of everything else, because the body and our attachments to, Lululemon pants and every other silly thing actually pulls us away from a relationship with God. It is physicality that takes us away sometimes from relationship with God. Prophets would pull themselves totally separate and almost leave life as we know it behind. Do you understand this? And go into prophecy. There is an exception to this. The ideal prophet, the highest prophet, Moshe Rabbeinu, he didn't have it in sleep. It wasn't in quiet. He was wide awake. It says that Moshe Rabbeinu, his prophecy was distinct from all other prophets in one expression. The Talmud says Moshe used a speculum, an asapaklaria, some sort of glass. Moshe Rabbeinu is like a person looking through a aspaklaria hameira, a shining piece of glass, a clear, bright, and everyone else, every single other prophet in all of history used an aspaklaria she'eno me'ira. That's how prophecy worked. They had one that wasn't quite so bright, and his was more bright. What does that mean? So there's a piece from, I think it goes back to the Choza of Lublin, but it's brought a couple places by the Bnei Yissaschar. Reb Tzvi Elimelech of Dinov says something that's like life-changing. He says, Moshe Rabbeinu was the humblest of all people. And that's important to keep in mind, because when you look through a window, right now we can sort of test out, right? This one right here, it ain't of that era. You know what I see? I see myself. Not completely. Sometimes you can see it too partially. But when you have a clouded lens, you see a lot of yourself. When you have something totally clear, when your ego's gone, when you're Moshe, you see right through to what's there. Got it? The humble person whose ego is out of the picture can make decisions. He can figure things out. Should I do this? Should I do that? The rest of us are like a person judging a court case. You're sitting there, and if this party wins, millions of dollars come to me. And if this party loses, I'm destitute. So I have to recuse myself. I can't judge such a case. Isn't that right? Because I have so much self-interest. Well, how am I going to then decide whether or not to observe the Torah? Whether or not to marry this person or that person? How to raise my children? I mean, I'm totally partial. And my Yetzer Hara is in the way. All of my desires, I want dignity, I want glory, I want money, I want that. So who says I'm making the right decision? You understand? Who says the rabbi in the synagogue is making the right decision when his job is on the line if he makes the wrong decision? So maybe he's not standing up for what's right, but he has a tremendous need to support his wife and, 17 children. They're hungry. You hear this problem. So the answer is, for the highest level person, the Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's why the giving of the Torah is on the humblest mountain, the lowest mountain. It's revelation. So many people come into Torah, and they sort of have the following attitude. And a lot of people start with this. Here's what I think is right and I think is wrong. I have a certain set of morals and ethics, and this is what I believe. Most of the things in the Torah, I think, make a lot of sense. There's a few things I just don't really get. So, okay, 612 is not bad, 611. And that attitude is a very interesting attitude. It's not crazy, but here's the problem. Can God teach you anything? Is it possible for you to come in and have your opinion changed by the Torah? There are groups within Judaism that's not possible for them, because the orientation is this. I once heard a boy, it's not his fault, someone else wrote his speech for him, but he got up and said at his bar mitzvah something along these lines. The Torah says that when there's a situation called the sota, here's how it's handled, and the woman drinks a certain thing. He says, but I don't believe this is ethical, because And he went on to describe why. And that was his bar mitzvah speech. And it was, listen, if he has those questions, I don't think we just tell him, shut up, your moral and ethical sense doesn't matter. You can grapple with such a thing for a lifetime. That's a worthwhile thing to do also. You don't just have to, God gave us a conscience for a reason. But that's not a bar mitzvah speech. A bar mitzvah speech is, I used to think this, but God said that, and now that I've adjusted and worked to try to something like that, or just say it right cover. It's very significant, though, because what he was taught that Judaism is, I don't know. I don't know if it is. I don't know if that's right. Can God change my mind is the question. Sinai says it's the lowest mountain, Na'aseh v'nishma. You know what? I'm committed to doing what God said. If I'm certain God said it, then I'll do that and I'll adjust. How many of you have changed your mind about a subject or two in your lifetime? Right? That's the nature of life. So to be so certain right now that I can't accept some humility is so necessary, but our ego gets in the way. Our personality gets in the way, and we see a little bit of ourselves. We're looking to find God, and half the window is showing me. And that was true about every prophet to some degree or another, so that every prophet spoke in their own signon, the Talmud says. Everyone had their own language. There's a language of Isaiah and a language of Jeremiah. How does an observant Jew who thinks God put those words in their mouth make any sense out of it, right? If God wrote this, why does Isaiah sound completely different than Jeremiah? If it was written by people, it makes total sense. If it was written by divine inspiration, it's challenging. That's just no. It was written by people who were divinely inspired, but it wasn't at the level of Moshe, who we call Shechina Midaberes Misokron. Moshe doesn't have a style. Moshe just is a conduit. Himself, he doesn't speak very well. Doesn't matter. It's not him talking. So I think that's the answer to your question. I think that, or at least, I don't know if it answers, but I think this might help along the search for an answer to your question. And that is that for people that are at the highest level, prophecy and communicating with God would not be in any way at odds with life. But for you and me, we almost have to pull ourselves out of our selfish experience of life. We can't be busy, awake, and busy with the world and doing everything if we want to focus on Hashem and understand that clearly. And perhaps that's a reason why they had to almost shut off. It's like I have to go into a dreamlike state, to a different place, a prophetic experience. That's a thought. But the question's better than the answer, which means that there's going to be, right? That means that it's a lot to think about. There's nothing like a good question. Okay, so the 1/60th business, right? We were saying that you take away 1/60th of a person's illness, a person who is suffering, if you're similar to them. So I want to point something very interesting out. When I hear I'm 40 years old, so I'm basically totally over the hill. And no, I'm a young man, right? But 40 years old, and then I hear about another guy who's 40 and he had a heart attack. So what do? That means I probably should be exercising more and playing more tennis and losing weight. But you know what? My mind does right away? It says, no, he smoked. He has a history of it in his family. Well, the first thing I do is make it clear he is not Ben Gilo. We're not the same. You see that? In other words, we automatically do that because otherwise it's going to cost me a lot. It's going to be difficult for me. And it really hits home. I remember, I don't mean to get too, intense, but I remember this is a very meaningful thing that struck me. I was one of my dear friends from childhood, Zach Plotzker. He's had a very eventful life. He recently got a kidney. His life was saved that way. When he was his second child was a beautiful little boy named Yoshua Arlen, Joshi, who died as an infant, 6 months old or something. A couple weeks before, I had been holding him. He was sweet as anything. And at the funeral, the whole community came. And it was very, very painful. It was very painful for everyone. There was one couple who had a son who was the exact same age. Exactly, within a few days. And they were close. And those little kids would have a play date at a few months old, whatever it was. But there was, and him and his wife, the parents of this, playmate of the child, kept breaking down in a way that was unique from almost everybody else who was there, including even family and siblings, because it was hitting them so close to home, because they were just holding their baby right next to this baby. And that's the secret of taking away someone else's illness. When you feel their pain so directly, that this is me. This is like I'm feeling a similar way about your pain, as I would if it was me, because it's so close to home. There are those who say, it says a famous teaching, if a person prays on behalf of his friend and he needs that same thing, he'll get answered first. So Abraham needed children, Avimelech, right? They were unable to have children. He prayed for him, and Abraham had children even before. So it's actually kind of true. The Avimelech, this Abrasara, is sort of true because praying for Avimelech actually brought about the birth of Yitzchak. So what's so interesting is that some want to read that Talmudic sentence as follows. Kol ha-mispala ba'ad chaver, if you pray for your friend, the hu tzarech, and you need that thing, you don't need it for him. It's not pity or empathy. You need it. You are so closely identified with this person that you want that so much for yourself. I want him to have children, then you'll be answered with your own personal things first. Is that a beautiful way to read it? In other words, it's an enormous task, but humans are capable of true empathy and true love for one another. It has to be Ben Gilo. You have to feel that person is just like you, and you have to let those messages hit you. It's evidenced in the Torah, says the Baal HaTurim, in a story where Yosef visits his father when he is sick. The very first time in the Torah that we find somebody visiting the sick is they come to Joseph and they say, Hinei avicha choleh. So he takes along his children to go visit his father. And they come on in, and when Yosef walks in, Vayitchazek Yisrael Vayeshev al Rosh Hamita. Israel is strong and sits up on the bed. So he gave him some strength. When he came in, his father was weak, but seeing his son, he strengthened, and he sat up on the bed. Says the Baal HaTurim that Hamita, the numerical value of Hamita is 59, because he took away 1/60th, and there was only 59 parts left of the illness. And he says that's the word. He sat up on the bed, and he says, why him? Because Rashi's told us in a few places that Yosef was very similar to Yaakov. Both of them had trouble with their brother, and so on and so forth. So many similarities. They looked even similar. I mentioned last night that when Yosef looked in the window and saw his own reflection, it reminded him of his father, because how would you look like his father, according to one approach. So this attitude is very beautiful. Yosef, who's so similar to Yaakov, and we find this with children, parents, in a good relationship, that's where we're going to feel this first. When your child is in pain, it causes you pain in a way that's intensely personal. It is not some sort of divorced armchair empathy from a distance. Okay. So going back to what we're saying first, before we go further, we're claiming that experiencing joy and happiness and positivity and warmth is a recipe for passing along Judaism and making idolatry, false ideologies that people get enthusiastic about, almost irrelevant. You'll hear them, you'll pick them up, but if you have the three regalim, if you have that celebration as the center of your Jewish experience, then everything else becomes much less significant and much less dangerous and much less alarming. That's the first point. In fact, the language of Elohei Masecha, false gods that are molten, just say idols. Why do I need to know the methodology of creating them? What was the purpose of that in this context? Right? It's an interesting question. So says the Ha'amek Davar, Elohei Masecha actually means gods that you pour wine to. When Moshe came down with the tablets, he was not ready to break them. But then when he saw people dancing, that's when he realized the golden calf is a massive problem. You see, if what really gives a person, and there are people like this, they are Jews, and they observe the Torah, but you know what gives them real joy? A bunch of other stuff. So they keep the Shabbos, but they're just counting down the minutes until Shabbos can be over, and I can finally get back to life. I can finally get back to the things that I truly enjoy in life. What brings me real joy? all kinds of other things. And there are real people like this. It's their watch, or it's their car, or it's their vacations, or whatever the other thing is. And it's not the authentic values of Torah they didn't learn to enjoy those. They didn't learn to enjoy Shabbat. They didn't learn to enjoy Jewish pride. They didn't learn to enjoy that. And that's heartbreaking. And so they're being raised in a way where their joy and their dancing, what gets these kids fired up? Goyish things. That's what they're enthusiastic about. Now, listen, there's nothing, I'm not in any way, a person who thinks, I take my children to the baseball games. I think it's great. I think it's a healthy outlet to be a Dodger fan, specifically. Any other team, right? That's great. You raise a kid who goes to the Yankee game. I can't think of something that's, it's healthy and there's some fresh air and it's not a video game. And it's wholesome. It takes 3 hours. You have to develop an attention span. They're changing pitches every 2 bad. There's something to it, but that can't be life. That can't be life. So you might think, okay, let's cut it out entirely. It's usually not so effective. Maybe if you're living in certain specific kind of interesting societies, but even then it doesn't seem to be working so well. You just can't play defense as your only strategy. So we try to create healthy homes, try to create healthy environments, but Elohei Masecha, what's dangerous is where you're pouring wine, linsoch yayin v'simchas v'reyos. It's gods that you drink to. I'll drink to that God. In other words, when the enthusiasm in your life, when the joy, when the celebration is centered around Elohei Masecha, so then it's at odds with Eschag Hamatzos Tishma. Call him Vaze Es Hamodos, a person who does not think that how you celebrate Passover or Shavuos or Sukkot is all that important. Well, throw yourself into it. Make it fantastic, because that is the alternative. That's what life is about. What you get joy out of and what you celebrate and what gets you on fire, that is a nation that is indestructible. And Bilam is told, you can even point to all of our flaws because we are not perfect people and we've made a lot of mistakes. And there are times that we didn't observe the religion. We worshiped idols. That's bad. And guess what? When you worship idols, you can just wash it. You don't even have, it doesn't require tshuva to get to the holidays. You're supposed to do tshuva. But even a person who is still kind of clinging to their golden calf, if what starts to make them dance is something other than the golden calf, they're not dancing for that anymore. Now they're dancing for the Shalosh Regalim. Now they're dancing for Simchas Torah, for Shabbos, for all of our ideals and values. I want to add one more thing, and then we're going to take a short break because there's some questions and things that people have to do with their friends next. But I want to and then we're going to come back to what we're learning about. I want to tell you one thing that I think is particularly important on this subject, and I wasn't sure if I was going to discuss this, but then it came up in a conversation last night with Rabbi Glazer, and I said, you know what, it is important to share this in this very context. The Jewish people are not having the easiest of times today. In many ways, our lives are absolutely wonderful. We all have fresh bread and milk and air conditioning and toilets, and we're living at a level of prosperity and relative comfort that Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, with all the riches of the world, would probably give half of it for a 2000 Toyota Corolla with a tape deck. Can you imagine? You can drive 60, 70, 80 miles an hour. What we have is unbelievable. It's unbelievable, and we're in a very blessed time. None of us are really worried, I hope, about Cossacks coming through town, pogroms. Like many of our ancestors, we couldn't sleep one night without being worried about this. On the other hand, we're under a lot of attack. The land of Israel, and we're very attached to our fellow Jews in a very meaningful way. just like a person is supposed to feel it more when their own brother is hurt than when an entire, there could be an earthquake in Bangladesh and thousands of poor innocent people are hurt. And that's a tragedy. But it still hurts me personally more when something happens to my own sibling. Even though I'm not saying that on a cosmic scale, one person is more important than tens of thousands. But that's the appropriate feeling. We really have those feelings. Some people are not even aware of it until they feel them. But we're blessed as a Jewish people with a Jewish identity when one young woman and her children are turned into a widow and orphans in the land of Israel by a wicked person who attacks them. I mean, it breaks our hearts in a very, very meaningful way. And so the question is, we're talking all about simcha and positivity and happiness and how critical that is and how important that is. What is the role of that? What is the role of that when we're also supposed, do we sit? What do we say at the Shabbos table? And we got to talk about what's going on in the land of Israel. We got to make sure our children are where they have to say the Tehillim and feel the pain. How do you balance this? So I want to share this perspective. There's a famous teaching from Nachman of Breslov. It's a mitzvah gedola liyos b'simcha tamid. What a great mitzvah it is to be constantly filled with simcha. There's some who take that in such a literal way that they just dance on the roof of a car, right, and play the music, and that's from morning, noon, and night. And I get a kick out of it. They're very sweet people. But what happens if you have to sit shiva? What happens? There are times in life. So what does it mean? Tamid, constant happiness. But I want to tell you something. If you come to a shiva Heskad, and the person says to you, I am so devoid of this has hit me so hard, I see no purpose in living anymore. There's nothing that can ever bring me joy. That's terribly alarming. Because even when a person is feeling crushing pain, a healthy person has a lot more going on in their psyche too. There are things that do bring them joy. And there are things that do bring them. I remember at the shiva, I told you about my good friend Zach. So when he was sitting shiva for his son, I remember his father-in-law. So this is the grandfather of this little baby, who was a very, very emotional person. And he was sitting there with his eyes closed for a while. And he turns to me and he says, Chana, he says, the fact that the community is surrounding us in this way and coming to sit with us for a week and coming to be here for us is the most beautiful thing I've experienced in my life. In other words, that didn't take away the pain. He's not 5 years old where it's like, now I'm happy, now I'm sad. You can just cheer the kid up after they scraped their knee and they forgot that. That's not a healthy person. But he was feeling enormous love from a community of people who care about him and love him and feel his pain. So there's a story. Rabbi Elchanan Bloch. Elchanan Bloch was the founder of the yeshiva Telz in Cleveland. He had come from pre-war Europe. And when he had come over, along with many others, many of them had come because they could get one visa. And then many people succeeded in bringing their families over. But unfortunately, many didn't. So people who were here suddenly learned of the deaths of their family members. So it was time for Simchas Torah. And he is dancing up a storm. He has the Torah, and he's dancing, and his face is radiating. And one of the students calls him over, between the hakafas, and says, Rabbi, you got the same news as us. You lost your family. I lost my family. How are you experiencing such joy right now? So he took the question seriously. He didn't brush it off. He sat him down. He said, I'll tell you. He said, there's a famous teaching of our sages that the angels, lo karav zeh el zeh kol halayla, the angels could not sing praises to God while the Egyptians were drowning in the Red Sea. Now, the Jewish people did sing praises to God. We have that, and we sing it every day, and it's a big part of our liturgy, Az Yashir, and yet they did not sing. The angels couldn't sing because God said, Ma'aseh yadai tovim bayam. My handiwork is drowning in the sea, and you guys are singing. So he says, well, then why could the Jews sing? Shouldn't they also? Did they do the wrong thing? So he says, no. He says, angels, we have this principle in the Talmud, every angel has one mission. Every angel is its mission. Raphael is healing. That's it. That's what Raphael is. He's not a guy sitting on the couch waiting for a job. He is healing. He is his mission. A human being has an identity, and then, as he said, angels have only one feeling at a time. That's the imagery. So for the angels to sing Shira would be unfair, because that would preclude them from having any empathy. And it is sad that a human being would live a life, God created them for a purpose, and look what bad path they went down to the point they have to be drowned in the sea. That's ultimately a very bad ending. We'd be much happier if our enemies would lay down their arms and come to real awareness. I don't know if we could trust them, but if you could trust them when they do that, that's the happy ending. That's the happy ending, is not to have to kill every one of them. So a human being, he said, can have two feelings at the same time. And therefore he said to his student, he said, I've never felt so crushed and broken in my life. I never felt such sadness and emptiness for the loss of my family. He says, but I also at the same time am feeling intense pride and gratitude for the opportunity to be a Jew and to have the Torah and to come from a long line of people who always put ethics and morals first. Avraham Avinu was willing to be killed in the fiery furnace, and so am I, and I'm proud of that, and I'm filled with joy about that. And at the same time, I'm also very sad. And this is not a contradiction. It is childish to think that you cannot be packed with simcha and positivity and also internally be feeling. So we have to be honest about that. That's not an excuse to just push out of our minds the suffering that exists. Be like, well, you can have two feelings. So you have to have both feelings, and you have to dedicate the appropriate time and attention to each one. And there should be times that are more meditative and more. And you have to think now with your children, what is the developmentally appropriate age? How much can they handle of this such a story? And how much, right? Like, in other words, you can't put too much on. But the attitude that simcha and positivity and warmth and happiness is very much a part of what it means to be a healthy and adjusted person. And we say harevna. We say in the morning blessings, when we talk about the Torah, we say something unique. We say, make the Torah sweet. Ha'arevna, make it arev. Make the Torah sweet in our mouth. Make it positive, happy, joy. I should love learning Torah. And then we say, it will then happen that us and our children and their children will all know your name and keep the Torah sincerely. In other words, it's a guarantee. If it's positive, it's happy, it's warm, it passes along. It passes along. Who wouldn't want that? There's a book called Off the Derech by Faranak Margulies. It's a very important and good book. It's a good read. She did real research for years and years, interviewing people who chose to leave behind observant lifestyles, who were raised in the observant world. And she has story after story in there. But she says the common denominator is that when things were done with rejection and with negativity and they didn't last, they didn't work, and people grew up to feel so negative. So I'll just give you like some simple, like one or two simple examples before we break. I need to educate a child. So I have a little kid, and my goal is with chinuch is that as they grow up, when they get to bar bat mitzvah already, they're ready to do it and beyond. So I need to teach them to wash their hands before they eat bread, because that's something that we do. Okay, that's a good idea. So what's the goal here? The goal is that they should feel good about this and know how to do it and be motivated to do it and want to continue this beautiful mitzvah tradition when they're on their own. So if I take the kid and I say, listen, buddy, you either wash your hands as I prescribe right now, or you're not getting any food, right? So, and they do it. And the parent is really proud, right? My kid, he always washes his hands. Like, but what have you taught him? In other words, is that working? And I've seen that sometimes, okay, you don't have to wash and you don't have to get any food. It's okay. And when you want to, you get it. The kid finally goes and does it. And the person is very satisfied but they may be teaching the child to hate it. So is that education? Like, what's the method? So it would seem to me, and again, there's no one size fits all, but that's another family in there. It would seem to me something closer to this is much more effective. Who wants to wash? Do you want to wash? The kid says, I don't want to. Well, it's okay because you're 5. And you don't have to when you're just a little kid, and that's fine. I don't know if I wanted to when I was 5 either. Right? That's okay. When you're a big kid, like right? When you're a big girl like mommy, when you're a big boy like that, then you will. Okay. That's the conversation. When they do, and sometimes they will want to, I'm not talking about using reverse psychology, like, well, you're a little baby. No, just very honestly, like, you're little, and that's okay. And you know what happens when they do? Pick them up in the air and say, I'm so proud of you. What a mitzvah you just did. That's great. they don't make a blessing. Don't make a big thing out of it. Just make the blessing yourself, right? Let them hear it. And you can remind them gently if they're ready for that. But if the kid is resisting, what's the goal? Just keep the long-term goal in perspective. The goal is that positivity and warmth and happiness should be associated with it. Rejecting someone and making them feel like you're not really a good person unless is a very, very bad tactic, because people will eventually realize that they can shake off that enormous, horrible weight that's carrying them down. And it's so freeing for them just to not have to. But whoever told you have to keep Shabbos? I mean, there is no Sanhedrin today. These are very good pieces of advice from God. Eitzos me'rocho is the language of the Rambam. They're the best possible piece of advice. They're really very strongly worded pieces of advice. I mean, what happens if you don't do it? I mean, nothing happens in your lifetime. And the world to come, as we understand, whatever you accomplish in this world, you reap the benefits of. Whatever, so if you want to stick your finger in a socket, it's not a punishment. I mean, it's just live your life out. And that's a very important thing. Nefesh HaChaim uses such a language. He says it's not world to come. It's not meant to be held over a person's head as reward and punishment. He says it's not derech hagemula. He's not very interesting thing. He says it's just consequences. God gave us the keys to let you know what's a worthwhile life, what's a refined life, what develops a person's inner world and soul so that they become who they're supposed to be. So it's a very, very important attitude for us. So let me just show you on the very back page. I highlighted this with a question from Reddit for all you NFL fans. Right? I figured there's, offense and defense. In the National Football League, that's what NFL stands for. Is it better to have an elite offense with horrible defense like the Raiders? Okay, this is how the person phrased the question. Or elite defense and horrible offense like the Broncos? I don't know what year they're talking about. I'm not, So here's what we put on the back here. We put offense and defense in terms of inspiring our children and ourselves. This could be either about children or it could be about adults. What is more important? In other words, right, as an example, right, an example for ourselves, if people are struggling, to properly maintain the way that they're handling themselves in a marriage, how much attention goes into stopping yourself from doing A or working on offense and building something stronger where you'll be less, and so forth. In other words, how do we balance those ideas? How do we keep them and ourselves safe from things that are damaging emotionally and spiritually? What's the balance of, in other words, it makes sense for a married man or woman to stay away from intense, close friendships with people of the opposite gender. That makes a lot of sense. In other words, so how much attention do we put into creating, how big do those boundaries have to be versus how much do we throw into it in terms of children? And we put here a few questions for everyone to discuss. So I think that the best way to do this is to take a few minutes and to pair up or with 3-4 people, however big the group wants to be, that works. Turn to the person next to you or across from you or somewhere and let's work on this for a couple of minutes. I think this could be a very valuable exercise, and then we'll come back and find out what people have to say and add some more. How does that sound? I think that these examples here, it's sometimes easier to play them out with children because we're all not children anymore. So it's easier to talk about how much to expose our children than if we were to be like, how much Netflix should you be binging in a week? How many hours of your life should you dedicate to, that's a lot more sensitive and close to home. But the truth is I've not seen too many rabbis or influencers in the Orthodox community be that effective when speaking about watching television is shtus. And it used to be you could get people to take a big move and like throw out their TV in the whole days. Someone would do that. But now that doesn't mean anything anyway because you have 9 other screens in the house and you're walking around with the 49 levels of Toma, right here. So everything's available. And so it becomes really, really tricky. And the real solution that I've seen just in our own lives is conscious offense. In other words, a person who decides, I'm going to study Torah on a regular basis because that's a value, and that winds up taking up time from trolling the internet or whatever, whatever the appropriate term is for, for just sitting there on the phone going like this. That's very, very meaningful. In other words, when we're conscious about one choice and another choice, and a very, very similar thing is true when it comes to children, of course, in much the same way. Three things we can do, broadly or specifically, to ensure the passing along of Judaism and Torah values to future generations. So the first thing is what we said in the blessing, I think is very important. Harev no. Make it sweet for us. If it's sweet for you, if it brings joy, if when the person is sitting in their home and they have joy in Torah, that passes along, whether it's to children, whether it's to nieces and nephews, whether it's to neighbors, whether it's to when a person is inspired and glowing and excited about what they're doing. So it takes focus and energy, because this is not the sort of joy and happiness and pleasure that comes from sitting back and doing nothing after a long week and you just sit and collapse, and that's the joy. It's something that requires conscious attention and focus and values. It's an achievement to celebrate like a Jew. But when a person can do that, a person who's really happy and loves what they're learning and loves Torah and loves, so then it's contagious and it passes along. That's one very, very important thing. The internal, you can control yourself. The great Chazon Ish said that it's really a person who genuinely loves and cares about others. That's the person who's able to pass things to others. And so that's a very interesting perspective, because it means you can always change yourself. And that's what causes, if I could just change you, I could get you to do this, is a feeling every one of us must have had about our boss or our friend or the person who sits next to us in shul. If he would just not smell like an egg salad sandwich, right? Or whatever the thing is, we have those feelings, and usually it's more judgy than even that. When I think of the things, if you would just not talk during davening, if you would just, and the answer is, there's the most effective way is to make changes internally. When we realize, in terms of passing on, this is very, very true with our children, because God always gives us just the right kids who push just the right buttons, and the thing, it's just the perfect thing. And so when I see my child who isn't benching or something, so then I think of myself as a failure. I think there's 100 things that are happening internally that have nothing to do with this poor child who just is sitting there being a kid and, doing whatever kids do. So it's very important that focus on internal work and working on being more positive and upbeat and seeing the good and happy things in life is what is probably the best thing that a person can do, because joy passes along, and joy is hard work. It's it's serious business. Yeah.
It's like the window thing we're talking about. Like, take your ego out of it so you can really see the kid and not yourself in them.
That's the key, right? It's really something. It's like the hardest thing in life, because whenever we have an issue with anyone or anything, it's just ourselves. I mean, this is what the psychologists, the psychiatrists, and the therapists say. But I'm only telling you that because I agree with them. Otherwise, it's, these psychologists are all nuts, right? Whenever you hear a rabbi speak, every psychiatrist is crazy. But if I agree with them, it's like, the big psychologist. So in this one, they got it right. They got it right. And they tell you that whenever you have any kind of extreme feeling about anything ever, that has nothing to do with anyone else. So in other words, if something makes me really mad, it just gets me so mad, it has nothing to do. It's only something internal. Otherwise, why are you feeling so extreme about it? Those feelings are intense, and it's like, wait a minute, what's really going on? I'll just give you one example. I had a fellow who lived in Jerusalem, Israel. He was a good man. He is a good man. At the time, he lived in Jerusalem, and so he took a lot of taxis because, having a car, you got to break into Fort Knox or something they charge you double in the taxes for an old, So he would just take the cabs. It was a lot cheaper. And his problem was that if he discovered that he found he couldn't give directions to the cab driver. Couldn't do it. The guy's the man's a professional. You don't tell him what to do. And in the meantime, he knows every time they go this way, you get stuck in terrible traffic at this time of the evening. And if you'll just take the Givat Shaul route to Har Nov, it's a lot quicker. So he wants to say, B'vakasha, Derech Givat Shaul. But his Hebrew was flying. He was good. And he couldn't do it. So, but he would really, and someone's just ask him. I can't. He couldn't do it. He then discovered that he also couldn't send back, if he ordered a sandwich in a restaurant or something, and they brought him the wrong sandwich. He couldn't say that. But if it was a female, he could. But to male authority figures, he clammed up until he figured out, this man is not my father. And even if he was my father, he really can't hit me anymore. That was a long time ago. And like, in other words, he had a tough childhood. Now, before we think about the father, this father was raised by Holocaust survivors who their first time around, his father only found out that his father had children and a wife before his mother, who all were like, so in other words, there's a lot of room to open your hearts to this guy who was tough on his kid. But that's not the point of it, is to demonize him. The point is that when this person realized, this is not my dad, and there's no reason to have these extreme feelings, and he healed an enormous amount of his life just by being aware that if I'm having an extreme feeling, you could go through life like, no, I'm just more of a timid, I don't like confrontation. And so I don't want, whatever, I'll eat a different sandwich. It's not a big deal. You think, wow, what a sweetheart, right? Maybe that's why he smells like egg salad. I don't know. But you follow? In other words, this is a really significant thing, that he was actually not in touch with what was. So whenever we have these extreme feelings and these extremes, you have to know it's us, and that's always an important principle. And by working at that, I mean, you can fix everything in the world that's around you much more effectively when you've done it. In other words, it's not just, well, work on yourself because you can't change anyone anyway. That's the root. That's the method. Okay, so I'll just share with you a couple last things, because now that it's our job, there's so much more. Meaning, of those questions that we asked, the big value in them is thinking about these things. A person shouldn't let a day of their life go by where there's not some part of their mind that's thinking, how can I be a better person? And how can I improve? And how can I continue? Don't give up. If you have an hour left to live, it should be a good hour. It should be a productive hour. It should be, certainly we all have long, productive lives ahead of us, I hope. But we're highlighting today as one of the big ones. Min hayadua, says Rabbeinu Bechaya. It is well known, ki birbos hasimcha, when a person has more joy, yes, to the extent that a person has more simcha, joy, happiness, contentment, yischazek hakoach hasichli. This is on page 3, Rabbeinu Bechaya, Bereshis 125. When simcha and happiness, it improves the intellectual capacity of a person's brain and makes a person more capable of intellectual achievement. There's a story with the Chazon Ish. This is in a book called The Making of a Gadol. And it brings a story that the Chazon Ish went to the beach with his students, and they were splashing around. The Chazon Ish started splashing the students. He was an old distinguished rabbi, and he was like splashing, and they didn't know what to do, splash him back. And he told them, everybody splash. He says, if you can fool around, then you can say Chidushei Torah. If you can fool around, you can be creative. You can be creative in Torah. A person who is paralyzed by fear. Rabbi Yitzchak Berkowitz in Jerusalem has a very successful kollel. Rabbi Berkowitz's kollel, I heard from Rabbi Shua Rose. He said that Rabbi Berkowitz would say he wants people to eat in the Beis Midrash. Bring in a snack with you if you want. Bring in your drink. He says, because I want people to be creative, and I don't see how you could be creative if you're not relaxed. There's a fellow named Dr. Bruce Perry. Dr. Bruce Perry is the number one neuroscientist in the world. He's a doctor. He's not a psychologist. He's a neuroscientist. And he's studying. One of the things he focused on tremendously was learning disabilities in children. And he says that it seems today that we have many more. Maybe it's because we're better at diagnosing them, but he doesn't think so. He thinks that we have a bigger problem. And he says that a significant number of them come from the following thing. The cortex is the part of the human brain that's responsible for creativity. It's responsible for assimilating new information that comes in. The problem is that when a person is a young child and a young kid, a little from baby and on, their cortex will not develop appropriately if they live with fear or uncertainty, and they fight off new information. And therefore, he says that there's an enormous correlation between children who come from homes where there's dysfunction or discord or a lack of a safe feeling to the ability of those children to be able to learn in school. And he said that they can track what's happening in the brains of these children. So now he says there's only 2 things that have been proven. He says millions of dollars a day around our country are being spent on all kinds of resource rooms and things. He says the only two things that are proven to make marked differences are teaching parents to have better, what he calls, shalom bias. I don't know what he calls it, but he has a term, teaching parents to create more stable, happy home environments for their children. Less arguing and more comfort, and the children aren't in fear. They're not. And secondly, he says, big brother and big sister programs, where children get attention that builds them up as an individual, and that they learn better in school. They're more so than almost anything else. And he goes through that, how you do it, how do you teach them, and how do you do things in a way where they're not worried about getting the wrong answers. And there's a lot of things that will go into the teaching method as well. He also talks about this with companies. If you have a company, you're going to want to create open cortexes in the people who work for you. You're going to want to create an environment where people can make a mistake, where they can be creative, where they can come to the table, because they'll be so much more productive. And the problem is oftentimes corporate structure does not allow for that. Oftentimes synagogue structures don't allow for that. Oftentimes yeshivas are not allowing for that. There's a certain way you must be, and you have to do. And the person who's creative, it can be very, very difficult for them to find a way to do it. Now, sometimes there's a you have a school that has a uniform. So then you're not going to be able to be creative with your clothing. But there's got to be other ways you can. There has to be, and that's okay. By the way, in other words, some of the most creative and amazing people that I know don't feel the need to have a reverse pink mohawk. That's not the way they express themselves. And yet they're very creative and very out there. So there's not only one way to do this, but it's very, very important to be able to give people the space. So it's actually this teaching of Dr. Bruce Perry. I did a lot of reading afterwards. The person who introduced it to me was a lecture I heard from Rabbi Daniel Kalish, who runs a high school in Waterbury. And Rabbi Kalish then said that he was embarrassed that he had to go to study from Bruce Perry something that's an explicit line in the Talmud. And he just never understood it. So that's sometimes how it is. There are teachings in our sages that make it clear that they understood that the world was a globe. And I'll read you the line from the Talmud. But the idea is that it's all there. It's all there, but sometimes we need, a Copernicus to come. Sometimes we need someone to come and show us something. They're like, oh, now I understand that it was all there in the Torah. So listen to what it says here. It says in Tainus, page 8, Rava Amar, said Rava, Im Ra'isa Talmud Shelimudo Kasha Alav Kebarzel. If you find a student who his studies are as tough as iron for him, he just can't. Bishvil Rabbo, it's because of his rabbi. She'eno masbir lo panim, he doesn't smile at him. It's because his rabbi isn't smiling at him. If he would embrace him warmly with a smile and make him feel like he should be making him feel, then he'd understand the complex material better. The Gemara says, well, then what's the solution? Do you just switch schools? Do you just move your kid to another place? Who says it's going to be better? Gemara goes on to say, "My takante yarba olav reyin." Make sure he has a lot of good friends who can help him out. Friendship, big brother, big sister. In other words, you need to meet that emotional need. The person needs to feel accepted and good and warm, and like it should come from the parents, but sometimes it can't. So find a big brother, big sister. In other words, it's so direct in the Talmud that this is the issue, that relationships are the core to everything. And so, whether or not we're happy, whether or not we are positive and warm, is something that makes the Torah pass along. It makes the Torah last. It opens up your mind. A person who's happy is open to new things. A person who's miserable, who's closed, their actual brain function suffers from it. Rabbi Elchanan knew this because if you know people and you see how it works, you can witness this. Now we have God has opened up the gates of wisdom that we can actually track this. And just the last thing here, the source about this is that the Talmud tells us, additionally, that any mitzvah that the Jewish people originally accepted with joy, to this day they're still doing it with joy, and that's bris milah as an example of that. And so the Talmud then says, mitzvahs they didn't accept with joy, that they don't pass along. So says Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, why is that true about joy and not anything else? What about mitzvahs, in other words, that were accepted out of fear? It doesn't say those are ones that are still done with fear. It doesn't say mitzvahs that were accepted out of, any other characteristic. It's only joy, not love. So he says, if I go and I plant an apple seed, do I know that it's going to be a lustrous apple or not such a good crop? The truth is you can't know almost anything. The only thing you know is it's not going to be an orange. You know it's going to be an apple. When you plant simcha, you harvest simcha. When you plant, that passes along, says Rav Hutner. In other words, that's what it's saying. It's saying if you do things with joy, then they will pass along to those around you, to your family, to yourself, to your... Those are things that last. They last in your life. So that years later, things that you got deep joy out of make such an incredible mark on your own life and your own experience. And certainly they will pass along. And one of the most important things to us as Jews is Jewish continuity. So first of all, be filled with joy. Work on it. I mean, be happy. Be happy. Be happy with your life, with your experience. Be happy with what's going on in the world. Even as you have other feelings too at the same time. Don't let any of that cancel out your happiness. And it will pass along. It will pass along to your children. It will pass along to your grandchildren. It's the greatest possible contribution. It's serious business and it's hard work. But there's nothing in the whole world. That has the capacity to be as transformative as simcha, as joy, and hopefully we can be given the strength, courage, and fortitude to really put this into practice more in our own lives. It will pay back every possible dividend and beyond. Thank you, everyone, for choosing on a day when you had time to yourselves to come and dedicate it to Torah and to being with the community. Listen, it gives me a lot of chizuk. It gives me a lot of positive encouragement to learn with such a beautiful group. I thank Rabbi Glazer and I thank everybody involved for putting together something so nice. And I look forward to future opportunities today and beyond to participate in this magnificent community.